Welcome back. We have another review for you today. We're looking at Jesus and John Wayne by Kristin de May. It's a history book on the history of white evangelicalism. In particular, it's a book that details how a specific vision and understanding of what it means to be a man, and therefore what it means to be a woman, has shaped the path, the alliances, and the trajectory of white evangelicalism in the last 70, 80, 100 years or so. And particularly white evangelicalism, because race is also a component to this, even if sometimes it's more overt and sometimes it's more subtle, but race is a component in this story as well. She goes back all the way to Teddy Roosevelt in post-World War I, but the story really picks up post-World War II as a particular vision of what it means to be a man and a woman took hold and was fought for within segments of white evangelicalism, particularly that men lead and women are called to submit. And one of the most interesting factors with this is that this wasn't always the case in evangelicalism, and it wasn't always the case even throughout this history that this was the only way of thinking about being a man and a woman. But it came out of a particular understanding of what was going on, what was the crisis that America was facing. So think post-World War II, you have the 60s, you have Vietnam. There's the sense of things are not going well. Things are not as they should be. It was something that not only conservatives, but people across the board, as she points out, were wrestling with. Things aren't right with the family. Families are disintegrating. There's challenges we're facing with Vietnam, with all these cultural shifts, and there was a particular way people envisioned what the problem was. There was a particular diagnosis, which led to a particular treatment. And that diagnosis was that men weren't leading and women weren't submitting. So part of the problem, what was going on in the 60s, what was going on in the 70s, 80s, 90s, up to now, what the fundamental problem with society. And of course, what happens in the home became connected with what happens in the church, what happens in society, with America and its role in the world. What's wrong? Men aren't being men. Women are trying to usurp, or men are being feminized, or the problem is that the gender roles aren't what they used to, and men aren't leading, women aren't submitting. And if we get that right, this will solve the problems. If we get that right in the home, in the church, in society, then that will solve the problem, that will end the crisis in some way. And so that diagnosis comes up in that sense of there's a crisis for men in particular. Particularly white men are in crisis. Shows up over and over and over again. And she has receipts going through speeches and publications and the kind of alliances that were formed throughout that period to show that this was a dominant and this was a fought for vision because that was the problem that was seen. That was the diagnosis. Connected with that is that vision of manhood is not simply that men lead, but there's a particular kind of, she calls Jesus and John Wayne, there's a very rule-breaking, aggressive, cowboy kind of mentality that is seen as the vision of what it means to be a man. So that's why it goes back to Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly, carry a big stick, but it really, the pop cultural icons of John Wayne, and then of course Ronald Reagan, and the fact that these segments of evangelicalism have been drawn to celebrities and movie stars. She talks a lot about that as well, but there's a particular vision of what it means to be a tough guy, to be a strong man that pervades all of this. And so that means that they look for particular types of leaders. And that's something she shows both in the church and in politics. And these things end up getting really closely tied together. I'd look for a particular type of strong man, aggressive, perhaps even rule-breaking leader who gets things done, because that's what it means to be a man. And Jimmy Carter was shut down because he was seen as weak. He was rejected because of his weakness. But if it was Ronald Reagan was a strong man, right? And there's that narrative plays itself out all the way to, as she points out, why did evangelicals in vast majorities vote for Donald Trump? Part of that is not that they voted in spite of values, but many voted because of their values. Because of he's what they think a strong man looks like. And so she also points out how militarism and support of the military, first kind of evangelizing and reforming the military, but then also just militarism in general. There's a lot of Cold War mentality that is pervasive through this movement, that the us versus them, the kind of mentality that was maintained during the Cold War, once the Cold War was over, got carried through into different battles. They had to find a different war to fight, culture wars, in order to keep that sense of solidarity, that sense of embattlement, that sense of group cohesion. She doesn't reference it, but it reminds me of what James Davison Hunter talks about when he talks about politics of resentment. He's drawing on Nietzsche, but the sense in which groups can be galvanized by being defined by what they're against, not what they're for. And that kind of shows up, even if there are statements about what they're for, this vision of manhood, this vision of what the society should look like. There's also a sense in which being against starts to define the politics of this movement. And I'm fairly evangelical adjacent. I grew up hearing a lot of this stuff that she's talking about, but I didn't grow up in the middle of it. I grew up in a church that was very theologically orthodox, Bible believing, but also believed women should be in ministry. So there was no strict gender hierarchy. I didn't have all that kind of stuff that she works through, but a lot of this felt really familiar. And very little of this felt surprising to me, even if I hadn't always put it this way. It was interesting that she kind of points out plenty of different times where this could have been different, where there were different paths that were explored, particularly the 90s, where after the Cold War there were different explorations of what it might mean to move forward as an evangelical movement. And different paths were taken by different groups, but there was a consolidation at different points. And that sense of crisis, that sense of embattlement around sex and gender, family, nation, America's role in the world, which all get kind of tied together, that happens particularly post 9/11. So there's a lot of exploration, and then 9/11 hits, and then there's a consolidation both in the culture, but also within evangelicalism toward that more pro-military, that sort of strongman leadership kind of bend. What's interesting too is that kind of feeds into an increasingly rigid and somewhat ironically utilitarian analysis of what it means to be a man or a woman, a Christian, an American, that her overall argument is that the vision of what it means to be a man is more influenced by John Wayne than by Jesus. And because of that, these groups became very comfortable with people who fit that vision of manhood, even if they didn't actually fit the vision of what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to follow Jesus. And so there are all sorts of excuses that are made along the way for lack of moral character from leaders that were supportive of the conservative white evangelicals. But they may not have shared really a robust faith. They may not have actually even walked like they knew Jesus. But they shared that vision of what it meant to be a man. They shared that strength that they were looking for, that they were going to fight for them. They were going to fight for their values. They were going to fight for what mattered to them. And that's what, in the last analysis, really mattered. So this is a really difficult book to read. I mean, it's a history book, so she doesn't need to make an apology for that. It's the people who made the history. She's simply writing it. But it is difficult to read. I mean, as someone who values the evangelical movement, someone, I say, kind of adjacent to it, I use the term evangelical for myself in some contexts and not in others. This was difficult. It's difficult to hear that this is part of the history of people that are both my people and not always my people. But it's also history that we need to hear. Because if we aren't aware of this, if we aren't aware of where we have been and the decisions we have made and the values and the mechanisms and networks that are reinforcing those values in our congregations and in our own lives, we're not going to be able to chart a different path. Evangelical pastors and pastors like myself have found that our congregations are shaped more by what they consume, even Christian content, during the week than they are by what we say on Sunday morning. So as we seek to disciple them, as we seek to lead them deeper in their walk with Jesus, we find that there are other factors, there are other influences, there are other places that are discipling them. And discipling them in ways that sometimes are helpful, but sometimes are very unhealthy for discipleship to Jesus. And if we're not aware of that, if we're not conscious of that, we're just going to get frustrated and throw our hands up. And this analysis gives us the ability to name what's happened, to name what's going on, and then hopefully chart a different path. It's not her job to chart that path for us, but it's for all of us who hear this and say, maybe this isn't the way we should continue to be. That maybe the wedding of politics and power and strong authoritarian manhood is not the way of Jesus. And it's up to us to chart a different way. This is a fascinating book. It's Jesus and John Wayne by Kristin de May. It's a controversial book. I know that lots of people love it, lots of people dislike it. I think it's worth reading. It's worth engaging. Please pick it up and read it for yourself. If you like the way I think about theology and books, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification button so you can be updated on more videos. If there's a book you'd like me to read and review, please let me know in the comments so I'll pick it up and take a chance to read it and hopefully review it here. I also have a couple books of my own. There Our Only Comfort, which is daily devotions through the Heidelberg Catechism, as well as Rooted, Growing in Christ in a Rootless Age, which is coming out June 7, 2022. I'll have a link to order both of those in the description. And thank you for your time.